I was 10 years old when I learned that in my family, being seen had nothing to do with how hard you worked. It had everything to do with who you were. My father came home from the shipyard that evening with steel dust ground deep into the lines of his hands and the smell of welding smoke clinging to his jacket. He dropped his lunch pail beside the kitchen door and placed a small piece of bent metal on the table between us. It was shaped like an anchor, rough around the edges, unfinished, something he had cut from scrap steel during his break. He rested both palms on the table and looked at my older brother Daniel. "A person is only worth what they can build with their own hands," he said. In our house, that sentence carried more weight than any prayer. My father worked long days repairing naval vessels at the Bremerton shipyard, and when he spoke, everyone listened. I stood 3 feet away, clutching a certificate so tightly the corners had folded inward. I had spent 6 weeks building a scale model of a guided missile destroyer from discarded metal parts and old wiring I collected behind the shipyard fence. The model had won first place at the county science fair. I had imagined this moment for days. I imagined my father smiling. I imagined my mother hugging me. I imagined Daniel telling me he was proud of me. Instead, my father glanced at the certificate for less than a second before his attention shifted toward the television in the living room. My mother was already setting plates on the table when Daniel burst through the front door wearing a muddy soccer uniform and holding a small participation trophy over his head. The reaction was immediate. My mother dropped the serving spoon, wrapped him in a hug, and called my aunt to tell her the news. My father grinned and clapped Daniel on the shoulder. The trophy was placed on top of the refrigerator where everyone could see it. My science fair certificate remained in my hands. Nobody asked what I had built. Nobody asked how long it had taken. Nobody asked how I felt. That was the first time I realized there were 2 sets of rules in our house. Daniel was celebrated for showing up. I was expected to prove my worth over and over again, and even then, it was never enough. As the years passed, I stopped expecting applause. I learned how to disappear quietly. When Daniel forgot his homework, I finished it for him. When my mother worked late, I cooked dinner. When bills went unpaid, I organized them by due date and left reminders on the kitchen counter. I became useful because useful people were harder to ignore. But even usefulness has limits when a family decides who matters and who doesn't. By the time I turned 16, Daniel's track ribbons covered an entire wall in our living room. Most of them came from local competitions where every participant received an award, but my mother treated each ribbon like proof that he was destined for greatness. My accomplishments lived in a cardboard box beneath my bed. Math competitions, robotics awards, academic scholarships. None of them ever made it onto the wall. Then my father died without warning. A steel cable snapped during a repair operation at the shipyard. The accident made the local news for 2 days before everyone moved on. I remember standing in the hospital corridor staring at the vending machine across from the waiting room while a doctor explained what had happened. Daniel collapsed into my mother's arms and sobbed so hard he could barely stand. Relatives surrounded him immediately. My uncles called him the man of the house. My aunts brought him food and blankets. Everyone worried about how he would handle the loss. Nobody asked how I was doing. While Daniel sat with family members accepting their comfort, I handled everything else. I called the funeral home. I reviewed insurance forms. I canceled my father's appointments and organized the paperwork on the dining room table. I stayed awake until nearly dawn, writing thank you cards to every person who attended the service because my mother was too overwhelmed and Daniel refused to help. When my mother walked into the kitchen the next morning and saw the stack of envelopes arranged neatly beside the coffee maker, she swept them aside with the back of her hand. "Move these somewhere else," she said without looking at me. "I need room to display Daniel's memorial photo." I picked the cards up from the floor one by one while she adjusted the frame around a picture of my brother standing beside my father's casket. Even grief had different rules for each of us. After my father died, Daniel struggled through school while I buried myself in studying. Every morning before sunrise, I ran along the waterfront while the naval ships sat anchored in the harbor beneath the fog. I watched sailors move across the decks and wondered what it would feel like to belong somewhere. At school, I joined the engineering club and spent weekends volunteering at the Maritime Museum. I discovered that discipline gave me something my family never could: certainty. Hard work followed rules. Effort produced results. The world outside my house made sense in ways my family never did. During my senior year, I applied to the United States Naval Academy without telling anyone. I trained in secret for the physical fitness test, running 5 miles every morning before class and doing push-ups on the cold concrete floor of our garage until my arms trembled. The acceptance rate was lower than most Ivy League schools. But I didn't let myself think about the odds. I focused on the next step, then the next one after that. The letter arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon in a large white envelope with an official seal in the corner. I carried it home inside my backpack, afraid the paper might bend. I waited until dinner because some small, hopeful part of me still believed this time would be different. I placed the envelope carefully in front of my mother and stood beside the table with my hands folded behind my back. Daniel barely looked up from his phone. My mother opened the envelope, scanned the first page, and set it down beside her plate. Her expression didn't change. "The Navy?" she asked flatly. "So you'll spend your life filing paperwork on some ship somewhere?" Daniel laughed without lifting his eyes from the screen. "Makes sense. Katie's always been good at organizing things." My mother folded the letter in half and pushed it back across the table. "At least you'll have stable employment. God knows somebody in this family needs to be realistic." For a moment, the room went silent, except for the sound of rain tapping against the kitchen window. I looked at the letter between us and felt something inside me shift, not break, not shatter, just settle into place with quiet certainty. I realized that no accomplishment would ever change how they saw me because they had decided who I was long before I had the chance to become anyone else. I could spend the rest of my life fighting for recognition that would never come, or I could build a life beyond the limits they had placed around me. I picked up the letter, folded it carefully, and slipped it back into the envelope. I didn't argue. I didn't explain that fewer than 10% of applicants were accepted. I didn't tell them the academy could open doors they couldn't even imagine. I simply stood up, carried my plate to the sink, and washed it in silence. Later that night, I sat alone on the back steps watching the lights from the shipyard reflect across the water. The cold air carried the distant sound of foghorns from the harbor. I thought about my father and the anchor he had left on the kitchen table years earlier. A person is only worth what they can build with their own hands. For the first time, I understood that I had been applying his words to the wrong battle. I had spent my entire childhood trying to build a place for myself inside a family that had already decided there wasn't room for me. That night, I made a decision that would shape the next 3 decades of my life. I would stop asking to be seen. I would stop waiting for permission to matter. If my family couldn't recognize my value, I would carry it myself. At dawn the next morning, before anyone else woke up, I loaded 2 duffel bags into the trunk of my old car, placed the acceptance letter on the passenger seat, and drove toward Annapolis without looking back. I didn't know then that the girl leaving Bremerton in silence would one day command fleets, disarm weapons designed to kill hundreds of people, and carry a star on her shoulder. I only knew one thing for certain. The next time my family saw me, I would no longer be the invisible daughter they left standing in the background. I would become someone they could no longer ignore. The first lesson they teach you in explosive ordnance disposal is simple. Every device was built by a human mind, which means every device can be understood by another human mind. Fear is natural, panic is fatal. If your hands shake, people die. If your thoughts drift, people die. If you allow emotion to override discipline, people die. I learned those rules long before I ever wore a Navy uniform. I learned them growing up in a house where every word had to be measured and every disappointment had to be swallowed before anyone noticed it existed. By the time I arrived at the United States Naval Academy, I had already spent 18 years mastering the art of staying calm while invisible. The academy only refined what my childhood had started. Plebe summer stripped away everything except discipline. We ran until our lungs burned, studied until our vision blurred, and learned that excuses carried no weight in a place built on accountability. For the first time in my life, effort mattered more than personality. Nobody cared who my family favored. Nobody cared whether I was quiet. They cared whether I showed up prepared, whether I kept my word, and whether I could be trusted when things became difficult. I discovered that I thrived in environments where expectations were clear and performance was measurable. While others chased recognition, I chased competence. During my second year, I attended a presentation by an explosive ordnance disposal officer who had spent 2 decades clearing mines in conflict zones around the world. He described the work with a calmness that bordered on reverence. He spoke about protecting shipping lanes, safeguarding civilians, and walking toward danger so others could walk safely away from it. Something inside me recognized itself in his words. EOD wasn't about glory. It wasn't about being seen. It was about carrying responsibility in silence. It was about solving impossible problems under pressure. It was about accepting that your best work would often remain invisible to the people you protected. I knew immediately where I belonged. The training nearly broke me. Nearly everyone who entered the program had been at the top of their class, and suddenly we were all struggling. We learned to operate underwater with limited visibility, to identify foreign munitions by touch alone, and to regulate our breathing when every instinct screamed at us to run. We practiced until procedures became instinct and instinct became muscle memory. Failure wasn't embarrassing. Failure was dangerous. Every mistake carried consequences measured not in grades or criticism but in lives. The instructors never raised their voices because they didn't need to. The weight of the responsibility spoke loudly enough. Years passed in deployments, exercises, and operations that rarely made headlines. There were nights in the Persian Gulf when I floated beneath black water with only a dive light cutting through the darkness. There were mornings in the Pacific when I stood on the deck of a destroyer watching the sunrise after 36 hours without sleep. There were missions I still can't discuss, and places I officially never visited. But no matter where I was in the world, my phone carried me back to the same place every time it vibrated. Home. Or at least the place I still called home, even though I hadn't truly belonged there in years. The requests always arrived without warning and without questions. Daniel needs help covering his rent this month. Your brother's business partner backed out. We need $5,000 by Friday. Daniel found an investment opportunity. It's time sensitive. You know how hard he's trying. Your mother could use a little help with property taxes this year. There was never a greeting. Never a question about where I was or whether I was safe. Never any curiosity about what my work actually involved. As far as my family knew, I handled paperwork somewhere on a naval base. They had decided that story years earlier, and I never corrected them. At first, I told myself I stayed silent because it protected operational security. Then I told myself it preserved family harmony. Eventually, I stopped making excuses. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. I was afraid that if they knew who I really was, they would still choose not to care. So I let them believe what they wanted to believe. During my third deployment, my mother called while our ship was transiting through the Strait of Hormuz. I had just completed a 16-hour operation involving an unexploded naval mine discovered near a commercial shipping route. My hands were still raw from handling equipment, and I could taste salt on my lips when I answered. She didn't ask where I was. She didn't ask if I was tired. She didn't ask whether I was safe. Daniel found the perfect car for his new consulting business, she said. It's important for clients to take him seriously. He needs $12,000 for the down payment. I looked out across the dark water beyond the ship's rail and listened to the sound of the engines beneath my feet. Less than an hour earlier, I had been kneeling beside an explosive device capable of sinking a cargo vessel and killing everyone on board. Yet somehow, in my mother's world, my most important responsibility was financing my brother's image. I'll transfer the money, I said quietly. I knew I could count on you, she replied before hanging up. No thank you. No goodbye. The transfer took less than 60 seconds. Over the years, those 60-second decisions added up. Utility bills, mortgage payments, credit card balances, business expenses, vacations disguised as networking opportunities. I covered them all. I told myself I was helping my family survive difficult times, but difficult times never seemed to end for Daniel. Every time one venture failed, another appeared. Every time he ran out of money, I stepped in. Every time I considered saying no, guilt stopped me. My father was gone. My mother was alone. Daniel needed support. That's what families do for each other, I told myself. Except support only flowed in one direction. When I was promoted to commander, nobody called to congratulate me. When I received my first combat commendation, nobody asked what I had done to earn it. When I missed Christmas because our team was deployed overseas, my mother complained that I wasn't making enough effort to stay connected. Daniel forgot my birthday 3 years in a row. My mother never noticed. Meanwhile, I remembered every anniversary, every holiday, every family emergency. I sent gifts. I mailed handwritten cards. I called whenever I could. I kept trying to earn a place in a family that accepted my sacrifices while ignoring my existence. The older I became, the harder it was to ignore the imbalance. During one Thanksgiving leave, I sat quietly at my mother's dining table, while Daniel spent nearly an hour talking about his latest business venture. According to him, he was building relationships throughout the defense industry. He used words like strategy, leadership, and national security as if repeating them often enough would make them true. My mother watched him with the same pride she used to show when he brought home participation trophies. Then she turned to me. "Daniel says he might start working with Navy leadership soon," she said. "Maybe he can help you get a better position. You shouldn't spend your whole life pushing paperwork." Around the table, relatives nodded sympathetically. One of my uncles asked if I had ever considered finding a civilian job with more opportunities. Another suggested I learn from Daniel's ambition. I listened quietly while people who knew nothing about my life explained how much more I could accomplish if I worked harder. I thought about the sailors who trusted me with their lives. I thought about the operations center where my recommendations shaped mission decisions across entire regions. I thought about the classified commendation locked in a secure cabinet hundreds of miles away. Then I looked at my mother's hopeful expression as she waited for me to agree that Daniel was more successful than I was. "He's doing well for himself," I said simply. The conversation moved on. It always did. But something had changed inside me that night. For the first time, I stopped feeling angry when my family underestimated me. Instead, I felt tired. Tired of carrying relationships that existed only because I continued to support them. Tired of shrinking myself to preserve their comfort. Tired of pretending their indifference didn't hurt. A few months later, after another successful deployment, I stood alone on the deck of our ship watching the horizon disappear into darkness. My phone vibrated with a message from my mother. "Daniel's business account is overdrawn. Can you help one more time?" I stared at the screen while the sea stretched endlessly around me. Somewhere beyond that horizon, my family was waiting for money from a daughter they didn't know and didn't care to understand. For the first time in my life, I didn't open my banking app immediately. Instead, I asked myself a question I had spent years avoiding. If I stopped giving them everything, would they still want me in their lives at all? I didn't know the answer yet, but for the first time I was afraid I already did. People assume rank changes everything. They imagine that once you wear stars on your shoulders, the world suddenly becomes fair. They think respect arrives automatically, that success heals old wounds, that achievement silences the voices that once told you that you weren't enough. They're wrong. Rank changes how strangers see you. It doesn't change how your family remembers you. In my mother's mind, I was still the quiet daughter who organized paperwork while Daniel was the charismatic son destined for bigger things. The years passed in deployments, training exercises, and responsibilities that grew heavier with every promotion. I learned to make decisions that affected thousands of lives. I learned how to absorb pressure without showing it. I learned how to walk into operations centers filled with senior officers and speak with calm certainty when everyone else was looking for answers. The Navy rewarded competence. Families don't always do the same. By the time I pinned on captain, I had led EOD teams through some of the most dangerous environments in the world. I had spent months aboard destroyers crossing contested waters. I had supervised underwater mine-clearing operations that reopened critical shipping routes. I had written recommendations that shaped naval strategy across multiple regions. Yet every time I drove back to Bremerton for holidays, I stepped into a world where none of it existed. My mother never asked about my work because she had already decided she understood it. To her, military service meant following orders and filling out forms. The idea that her daughter could carry responsibilities beyond her imagination never seemed to occur to her. Daniel, meanwhile, had reinvented himself so many times that I had lost count. Real estate consultant, venture capitalist, security advisor, defense industry entrepreneur. Every few years he adopted a new title and a new business card. The details changed, but the pattern never did. He made promises, spent money he didn't have, and expected someone else to absorb the consequences when things fell apart. That someone was almost always me. At family gatherings, Daniel spoke with the confidence of a man who had never faced real failure because he had never been forced to live with its consequences. If a business venture collapsed, I paid his debts. If an investment disappeared, I covered the losses. If creditors called, my mother asked me to fix it. Over time, Daniel stopped viewing my support as generosity. He viewed it as an entitlement. The worst part was that I helped create that expectation. Every transfer I approved, every bill I paid, every excuse I made for him reinforced the belief that I would always be there to clean up the mess. The more successful I became professionally, the smaller I allowed myself to become personally. I convinced myself it was easier that way. Easier to stay silent than to explain. Easier to avoid conflict than risk rejection. Easier to let people underestimate me than discover they still wouldn't care after learning the truth. One Thanksgiving, I returned home after completing a classified deployment in the Indo-Pacific. 48 hours earlier, I had been standing in an operations center reviewing intelligence reports about maritime threats near critical shipping lanes. The work had been exhausting, but meaningful. For the first time in weeks, I slept in my childhood bedroom beneath shelves. My mother still used to store old photo albums of Daniel's high school sports teams. Every picture frame in the house told the same story. Daniel receiving a trophy. Daniel giving a graduation speech. Daniel smiling beside one of his many failed business ventures. There wasn't a single photograph of me in uniform anywhere in the house. At dinner, Daniel arrived wearing a tailored charcoal suit and an expensive watch I recognized immediately because I had paid for both. My mother greeted him at the door like a returning celebrity. She kissed his cheek, took his coat, and announced to everyone that her son was doing important work with defense contractors. Daniel smiled modestly, the way people do when they know exactly how impressive they appear. Once everyone sat down, he began talking. For nearly an hour, he described meetings that may or may not have happened, partnerships that never seemed to materialize, and opportunities that always required more money than he currently had. The details shifted constantly, but nobody questioned them. Confidence has a way of sounding like competence to people who want to believe. Then Daniel leaned back in his chair, lifted his glass, and casually said, "I've been building some strong connections inside the Navy lately. You'd be surprised who takes my calls these days." My mother beamed with pride. My aunt asked who he was working with. Daniel smiled as though he were deciding how much information to reveal. Vice Admiral Rebecca Lawson and I have spoken several times over the past few months. She's interested in some ideas I have about maritime security. The room fell silent for a moment before everyone reacted exactly the way Daniel expected. My uncle let out a low whistle. My cousins leaned forward with interest. My mother looked around the table with an expression that practically demanded admiration. I sat perfectly still. Vice Admiral Rebecca Lawson was not merely someone I knew. She was my direct subordinate. 3 weeks earlier, she had stood in my office, presenting recommendations for a new underwater threat detection initiative. She addressed me as ma'am. She waited for my approval before implementing operational changes across her command. The idea that she was secretly seeking business advice from my brother would have been laughable if it weren't so unsettling. Daniel continued talking, encouraged by everyone's attention. Rebecca says, the Navy needs fresh perspectives. People from outside the system who understand innovation. We're discussing some exciting possibilities. I studied his face carefully. There was no hesitation in his voice. No sign of embarrassment. He had repeated these stories so often that he believed them himself. Across the table, my mother turned toward me with the familiar expression I had known my entire life. A mixture of disappointment and expectation. "See, Katie?" she said. "Your brother understands how to build relationships. That's why successful people trust him. Maybe you should ask him for career advice. It might help you move beyond administrative work." Laughter rippled around the table. Not cruel laughter, casual laughter. The kind that hurts more because nobody realizes they're causing pain. I smiled politely and took a sip of water. Years earlier, I might have felt angry. Instead, I felt something else. Distance. For the first time, I saw my family clearly. They weren't choosing Daniel because he was more accomplished. They were choosing the version of success they understood. Daniel was loud, confident, and visible. I was quiet, disciplined, and absent. He told stories. I kept secrets. He demanded recognition. I avoided attention. They couldn't value what they couldn't see, and I had spent decades making sure they saw as little as possible. Later that evening, while I loaded dishes into the dishwasher, my mother followed me into the kitchen. She lowered her voice as though sharing something important. "Your brother is close to landing a major contract," she said. "He's under a lot of pressure. If he asks for financial help again, I hope you'll support him. Families should lift each other up." I looked down at the plate in my hands. The irony was almost unbearable. Families should lift each other up. I wondered what it would feel like to be on the receiving end of that belief. I wondered whether my mother had ever noticed that every time Daniel fell, I was the one carrying his weight. Before I could answer, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I glanced at the screen. It was a secure message from Vice Admiral Lawson. Urgent. Requesting immediate review of Pacific operational assessment. I locked the screen before my mother could see it. She misinterpreted the movement entirely. "Work can wait until tomorrow," she said dismissively. "You're always so focused on those office tasks." Office tasks. I nodded quietly because correcting her felt pointless. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom while the house settled around me. I thought about Daniel using the names of naval leaders to elevate himself. I thought about my mother asking me to finance his future while dismissing everything I had built. I thought about the strange exhaustion that comes from being deeply loved by your colleagues and completely misunderstood by your family. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, I realized something I had avoided acknowledging for years. My silence wasn't protecting our relationship anymore. It was protecting their illusion. And illusions, no matter how comfortable, eventually collide with reality. I just didn't know when that collision would happen, or how much damage it would cause when it did. People imagine promotions happen in a single moment. They picture a ceremony, a new insignia pinned onto a uniform, a round of applause, and a photograph that captures the achievement forever. What they don't see are the thousands of invisible decisions that come before it. The missed holidays, the sleepless nights, the deployments that blur together until entire years disappear into oceans, operations centers, and classified reports. By the time I pinned on my first star and became a Rear Admiral, the promotion felt less like a victory and more like the acceptance of a heavier burden. I stood in my dress whites while senior officers congratulated me, but all I could think about were the people who should have been there and weren't. My father had been gone for nearly 20 years. My mother had declined the invitation because Daniel was attending a networking conference in Seattle that same weekend. "You understand, don't you?" she had said over the phone. "His future depends on making the right connections." I told her I understood because I always did. After we hung up, I folded my phone into my pocket and walked into the ceremony alone. The Navy became my family because it was the only place where effort and sacrifice translated into trust. The people I served with knew exactly who I was. They knew how many hours I spent preparing for missions. They knew what it meant to make decisions when mistakes could cost lives. They had seen me exhausted, frightened, injured, and determined. They respected me not because of my rank, but because they had watched me earn it one difficult day at a time. Yet every time I returned home to Bremerton, I stepped back into the role my family had assigned me decades earlier. Quiet Katie, the dependable daughter, the one who would always help but never ask for anything in return. The contrast between those two worlds grew sharper with every passing year. In one world, admirals sought my advice before approving operations. In the other, my mother still reminded me to organize my paperwork more carefully. One rainy afternoon in early spring, I drove to her house after spending 3 weeks overseeing a multinational underwater ordnance exercise in the Pacific. The operation had involved 6 allied nations, dozens of ships, and the successful neutralization of simulated threats across thousands of square miles. We had spent months planning every detail. The mission was considered a major success. By the time I reached Bremerton, all I wanted was a quiet cup of coffee and a few hours with family. I found my mother in the kitchen sorting through a stack of mail. She barely looked up when I walked in. "You're here early," she said. "Daniel should be arriving soon." She handed me a grocery list without asking about my trip. I took the list automatically because that's what I always did. As I turned toward the counter to set down my keys, something caught my attention. Resting on top of the trash can beneath a pile of newspaper advertisements was a thick, cream-colored envelope embossed with a gold Navy seal. My name was printed clearly across the front. Rear Admiral Katherine Hayes. I reached into the trash and pulled it free. The envelope had already been torn open. Inside was an invitation printed on heavy cardstock. The International EOD Leadership Summit. Guest of honor. Keynote speaker. Naval Base San Diego. I stared at the words for several seconds. The summit was the most prestigious event in the explosive ordnance disposal community. Senior military leaders, allied commanders, defense officials, and members of Congress attended every year. I had been selected to deliver the keynote address because of our team's work modernizing underwater mine countermeasure operations throughout the Pacific. It was one of the highest professional honors of my career. My mother glanced over her shoulder and shrugged. "Oh, that thing. I thought it was junk mail." I looked up slowly. "You opened it?" She waved her hand dismissively. "Of course I opened it. It came to my address." She returned to sorting coupons as if nothing unusual had happened. "Honestly, Catherine, these military organizations are always sending out exaggerated nonsense. Guest of honor? Rear Admiral? You know how they try to make ordinary jobs sound important?" I held the invitation in my hands and felt something tighten inside my chest. Not anger, not surprise, just the familiar ache of realizing that even now, after everything, she still saw only what she had already decided to believe. Before I could respond, The front door opened and Daniel walked in carrying an expensive leather briefcase. He greeted our mother with a hug before turning to me. "Katie," he nodded politely. "Good to see you." His attention shifted immediately to the invitation in my hands. "What's that?" Before I could answer, my mother laughed. "Some military event trying to convince your sister she's more important than she is," Daniel smirked. "You should be careful with those things. Lots of scams target government employees." I folded the invitation carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. Arguing would accomplish nothing. It never had. We sat down for dinner an hour later, and as always, the conversation revolved around Daniel. His latest consulting project was facing financial difficulties. Investors were becoming hesitant. New opportunities required additional capital. My mother listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions and offering encouragement. Then she turned toward me. "Actually, Katherine, this is perfect timing. Your brother could use some help." Daniel looked down at his plate with practiced reluctance. "It's only temporary. Once the contract comes through, I'll pay everything back." I had heard the same promise so many times I could recite it from memory. "How much?" I asked quietly. Daniel named a figure large enough to cover a year's tuition at a state university. My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Family takes care of family." The word settled heavily between us. Family takes care of family. I thought about the invitation in my purse. I thought about the years of missed birthdays and forgotten milestones. I thought about the countless times I had transferred money without hesitation, while receiving nothing in return except more expectations. For the first time, I hesitated. Daniel noticed immediately. "You're doing well, aren't you?" he asked. "I mean, the Navy takes care of its people. It's not like you have kids or a mortgage." My mother nodded in agreement. "Besides, you're always so responsible with money." Responsible. The word stung more than I expected. Not because it was inaccurate, but because it reduced my entire life to a function. In their minds, I wasn't a daughter, a leader, or a woman who had dedicated decades to protecting lives. I was a resource. Reliable, available, predictable. A safety net they assumed would always be there. That night, I stayed in my childhood bedroom and reread the invitation several times beneath the soft glow of a bedside lamp. I traced my finger over the gold lettering and thought about everything it represented. Every deployment, every sacrifice, every operation, every moment I chose duty over comfort. The invitation wasn't simply recognition, it was proof that my work mattered, that my life had meaning beyond the narrow role my family assigned me. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text message from my mother. "Don't forget to transfer the money before Friday. Daniel is counting on you." A second message arrived moments later. "Also, I managed to get us tickets to your Navy conference in San Diego. Daniel wants to network with defense executives. Wear something simple, nothing flashy. And please don't embarrass us by talking about work too much." I stared at the screen for a long time before setting the phone face down. Somewhere deep inside me, something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once. More like the quiet movement of tectonic plates beneath the surface. Slow, invisible, irreversible. For 30 years, I had protected my family's version of me because I believed preserving peace was more important than telling the truth. But sitting alone in that small bedroom with a discarded invitation beside me, I began to wonder whether peace built on invisibility was really peace at all. I didn't answer my mother's message that night. Instead, I placed the invitation carefully back into its envelope and made a decision. I would go to San Diego. I would sit beside my family. I would say nothing, and for the first time in my life, I would stop protecting the illusion they had created about who I was. If they wanted to believe I was ordinary, I would let reality correct them on its own. People think the truth arrives like lightning. They imagine a single moment when everything changes instantly, when lies collapse all at once, and years of misunderstanding disappear in the space between one breath and the next. The truth is more complicated than that. Most of the time, the truth arrives quietly. It waits patiently while people build entire lives around assumptions, and then, when the moment is right, it simply stands still and lets those assumptions destroy themselves. I flew into San Diego 2 days before the International EOD Leadership Summit to attend final briefings and review the event schedule with my staff. The conference brought together military leaders from more than 20 countries, senior defense officials, members of Congress, and some of the most experienced explosive ordnance disposal operators in the world. The keynote address I had prepared would be delivered to an audience of nearly 2,000 people. Every detail of the event had been planned months in advance. Security protocols, transportation routes, seating arrangements, media access, and ceremonial procedures had all been coordinated with precision. As the guest of honor, I was scheduled to arrive through a secure entrance reserved for flag officers and senior government officials. Instead, I instructed my aide to cancel the escort and told her I would arrive with my family. She looked at me carefully but asked no questions. The people who worked closely with me understood that some operations involved risks that couldn't be measured on briefing slides. The night before the summit, my mother, Susan, and Daniel arrived at their hotel filled with excitement. Daniel spent most of dinner talking about the opportunities he expected to find at the event. According to him, defense contractors had become increasingly interested in his consulting business, and he was confident the summit would help him expand his network. He spoke about military leaders as if they were old friends. He casually mentioned admirals and procurement officials whose names he had collected from news articles and public reports. My mother listened with pride shining in her eyes. Every time he described a future success, she nodded as though it had already happened. I sat across the table and listened quietly. The years had taught me that correcting people who are invested in their own stories rarely changes anything. Reality works more effectively than arguments ever could. The next afternoon, I met them in the hotel lobby. My mother adjusted the collar of my dark navy dress and frowned. "You could have worn something nicer," she said. "There will be important people there." Daniel checked his reflection in the glass doors and straightened his tie. "It's probably for the best," he said with a shrug. "People respect humility." I almost smiled at the irony. My mother handed me her purse without asking if I minded carrying it. I took it automatically, a habit built over decades. As we climbed into the car, she reviewed the evening's expectations the same way she always had before family events. "Stay close to us. Let Daniel do the talking. If someone asks what you do, just say you work in administration for the Navy. People don't need unnecessary details." I stared out the window as the city moved past us in fading sunlight. The closer we came to the naval base, the calmer I felt. For years, I had imagined what this moment might feel like. Anger, vindication, satisfaction. Instead, I felt something closer to acceptance. I wasn't going there to prove anything. I wasn't going there to embarrass anyone. I was simply going to stop hiding. We reached the security checkpoint just after sunset. Floodlights illuminated the entrance while sailors directed vehicles toward inspection lanes. My mother lowered her window and held out the printed invitations she had received through a retired officer she knew from her book club. The young sailor at the gate greeted her politely and scanned the documents. Then he looked toward me. "Identification, ma'am." Before I could reach for my bag, my mother laughed lightly. "She's with us. Just my daughter." The sailor remained professional. "I still need to verify every guest." My mother sighed impatiently. "Honestly, she's been in the Navy for years doing office work. Nothing important. Can we move this along?" The words settled into the silence between us. For a moment, nobody moved. Then I reached into my handbag and removed my common access card. I handed it to the sailor without saying a word. His flashlight swept across the card, paused on my photograph, then shifted to the insignia printed beneath my name. I watched the recognition happen in real time. His expression changed instantly. His posture straightened. The color drained from his face. He looked down at the card again as if checking whether his eyes had made a mistake. Then his training took over. He stepped back from the car and snapped to attention so quickly that the sound of his heels striking the pavement echoed through the checkpoint. "Rear Admiral Hayes, ma'am." His voice carried clearly through the evening air. My mother's smile disappeared. Daniel froze in the back seat. The sailor pressed a hand to his earpiece and spoke rapidly into his radio. "Flag officer on site. Repeat. Guest of honor has arrived at Gate 3. My mother leaned toward him, confusion spreading across her face. "There must be some mistake," she said. "My daughter works in administration." The sailor didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on me. "No mistake, ma'am." Within seconds, the checkpoint transformed around us. Security personnel moved into position. A black staff vehicle pulled to the curb. The side door opened, and Master Chief Marcus Cole stepped out wearing dress whites. I had served with Marcus for nearly 15 years. We had survived operations together that neither of us discussed outside secure rooms. The last time we worked together, we spent 18 hours coordinating a multinational response to a maritime explosive threat in the Pacific. The moment he saw me, his face broke into a grin. He stopped 6 feet away and delivered a flawless salute. "Rear Admiral Hayes, ma'am. Welcome to San Diego. The summit committee has been awaiting your arrival. The world inside the car seemed to stop moving. My mother's hands tightened around the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. Daniel stared at Marcus, then at me, then back at Marcus, as if trying to solve a problem his mind couldn't process. I returned the salute. "Good to see you, Master Chief." He lowered his hand and nodded toward the waiting vehicle. "The commander of the Pacific Fleet asked me personally to escort you to the main hall." My mother finally found her voice. "Katherine?" she whispered. I turned toward her slowly. For the first time in my life, she was looking at me without assumptions, without certainty, without the comfortable story she had repeated for decades. She was seeing a stranger. I opened the car door and stepped onto the pavement. Cool evening air brushed against my face. Behind me, I could hear Daniel breathing too quickly. My mother sat frozen in silence. There were 1,000 things I could have said in that moment. I could have listed my accomplishments. I could have reminded them of every sacrifice they ignored. I could have asked why they never cared enough to learn who I was. Instead, I simply handed my mother's purse back to her. "I'll see you inside," I said quietly. Then I turned and walked beside Marcus toward the waiting vehicle. Behind us, the gate remained silent except for the sound of my mother's unanswered questions hanging in the air. As the car pulled away from the checkpoint, I looked through the window at the distant lights of the conference center ahead. In a few minutes, I would walk into a ballroom filled with people who knew exactly who I was. For the first time in 30 years, my family would walk into that same room and discover the truth at the same time as everyone else. And there would be no way to look away. The ballroom doors opened slowly, and the first thing I heard was silence. Not the polite silence of a formal event, or the distracted silence of people waiting for the next speaker. This was the kind of silence that settles over a room when everyone understands they are witnessing something important. Nearly 2,000 people filled the hall inside the San Diego Naval Base Conference Center. Senior officers in dress whites, allied commanders from partner nations, members of Congress, civilian defense leaders, and explosive ordnance disposal operators from around the world sat beneath crystal chandeliers and massive banners displaying the insignias of EOD units that had served across generations. As I stepped through the doorway beside Master Chief Marcus Cole, every person in the room rose to their feet. The sound of hundreds of chairs moving across the floor rolled through the ballroom like a wave breaking against a seawall. I had attended military ceremonies for most of my adult life, but standing there in that moment, I still felt the weight of what was happening. This applause wasn't for rank. It wasn't for medals or titles. It was for decades of work performed in places few people would ever see and sacrifices most people would never fully understand. At the front of the room, Admiral Thomas Mercer, commander of the Pacific Fleet, walked down the center aisle toward me with a smile that carried both pride and respect. He took my hand firmly in both of his. "Katherine," he said warmly, his voice carrying through the microphone clipped to his jacket. "We've been waiting all evening for you." Cameras flashed around us as he escorted me toward the stage. I glanced across the room and found my mother and Daniel sitting near the back beside a group of civilian guests. Their expressions looked almost unreal beneath the ballroom lights. My mother's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on me with the stunned disbelief of someone trying to reconcile two completely different versions of reality. Daniel sat motionless, his shoulders rigid, his face pale. For years, he had built stories around borrowed prestige, dropping names of military leaders to impress anyone willing to listen. Now he sat in a room filled with the real people behind those titles, and every one of them knew exactly who I was while barely noticing he existed. I climbed the stairs to the stage and turned toward the audience. Behind me, a massive screen illuminated the room with my official portrait in dress uniform. Beneath it were the words, "Rear Admiral Katherine Hayes, United States Navy, Explosive Ordnance Disposal, Guest of Honor." The room settled into silence again as Admiral Mercer stepped to the podium. "Tonight," he began, "we recognize a leader whose career has defined service, courage, and humility. Rear Admiral Katherine Hayes has spent more than 25 years protecting lives in some of the most dangerous environments on Earth. She has led multinational mine countermeasure operations, modernized underwater threat response capabilities across the Pacific, and personally overseen missions that safeguarded thousands of service members and civilians alike." The screen behind me changed to photographs from different stages of my career, images of me in dive gear preparing for underwater operations. Briefing rooms filled with officers waiting for instructions, naval vessels cutting through dark water, Teams of EOD technicians standing together after successful missions. With each image, I could feel the room's attention shifting away from the rank on my shoulders and toward the life behind it. There are leaders who seek recognition, Admiral Mercer continued. And there are leaders who spend their careers ensuring others return Beauchamp safely without asking for recognition at all. Rear Admiral Hayes belongs to the second group. I looked toward the back of the room once more. My mother's eyes had filled with tears. Daniel stared down at his hands. For the first time in my life, neither of them looked certain of anything. When Admiral Mercer finished speaking, I stepped to the podium. For a moment, I simply looked out across the room. Hundreds of faces stared back at me. Some belonged to people I had served beside. Others belonged to men and women I had mentored. Many belonged to families who understood exactly what military service asks of those who choose it. I took a slow breath and began. People often think courage means running toward danger. Sometimes it does. But in my experience, courage is usually quieter than that. Courage is showing up every day without applause. It's carrying responsibility when no one sees the weight you're carrying. It's doing difficult things without expecting recognition in return. The room remained completely silent. The men and women of the EOD community understand this better than anyone. We work in darkness so others can live in safety. We solve problems most people never know existed. We accept that our greatest successes are often the moments nobody hears about because disaster was prevented before it happened. I paused, letting my gaze drift briefly toward my mother. But I've learned something else over the years. Service should never require self-erasure. Sacrifice should never mean becoming invisible. There is a difference between humility and hiding who you are. There is a difference between supporting the people you love and disappearing so completely that they forget to see you at all. My mother's head lowered. Daniel's expression tightened. There was no anger inside me as I spoke those words. Only clarity. I wasn't exposing them. I was finally refusing to hide myself. After the speech ended, the audience rose to its feet again. The applause seemed to last forever. Colleagues approached to shake my hand. Officers introduced me to their families. Young sailors thanked me for my leadership. Throughout it all, I remained aware of my mother and brother standing quietly at the edge of the room, waiting. When the reception finally ended, I found them near the exit. For a moment, none of us spoke. My mother looked older than she had earlier that day. The certainty she carried for decades had vanished, replaced by something fragile and unfamiliar. Regret. Katherine, she said softly, her voice trembling. Why didn't you tell us? I held her gaze for a long moment before answering, because for 30 years, nobody asked. The words settled between us gently but firmly. Not an accusation, just the truth. Daniel looked down at the floor. I didn't know, he said quietly. I know, I replied. That's the problem. We stood there in silence for several seconds before my mother began to cry. Not the dramatic tears I remembered from childhood. These were quieter, heavier. The tears of someone forced to confront the distance between who they believed they were and the pain they caused without realizing it. She apologized. Not perfectly, not eloquently, but honestly. For the first time in my life, she acknowledged the years she spent overlooking me. For the first time, Daniel admitted that he had accepted my support without understanding what it cost me. Forgiveness did not happen in that hallway. Healing rarely happens in a single moment, but accountability began there, and sometimes that is where healing starts. The next morning, before my flight home, I opened my banking application and canceled every automatic transfer connected to Daniel's accounts and my mother's expenses. I sent a simple message to both of them. I love you. I will always love you. But I can no longer protect you from the consequences of your choices. Boundaries are not punishment. They are how we protect what remains of ourselves. Over the following months, our relationship changed slowly. Daniel found a steady job instead of chasing another unrealistic opportunity. My mother started asking questions she should have asked years ago. Not about money, about me. She wanted to know where I had served. She wanted to understand what EOD meant. She wanted to hear stories about my career. Some conversations were awkward, some were painful, but for the first time, they were real. A few weeks later, my mother invited me back to Bremerton. When I walked into the house, I noticed something immediately. The wall that once displayed Daniel's trophies had been cleared completely. In their place hung a framed photograph of me in dress white standing beside my EOD team. Beneath it was the small steel anchor my father had made all those years ago. My mother handed it to me carefully. "I found this in your father's toolbox," she said through tears. Etched into the metal were 5 simple words. "My strongest anchor, Katie." In that moment, I realized something that changed everything. My father had seen me all along, he just never knew how to say it. I spent 30 years believing I had to earn the right to be loved when the truth was much simpler and far more painful. The people around me could only value what they were willing to see, and I had spent decades helping them look away. If there is one lesson my journey taught me, it is this: your silence may keep the peace, but it can also keep you invisible. You do not need to diminish yourself to make other people comfortable. You do not need to carry everyone else's burdens while hiding your own achievements. You do not need permission to be proud of the life you built. If this story reminded you of someone who spent years feeling unseen, share it with them. And if you've ever made yourself smaller so others could shine, tell me in the comments. What was the moment you finally decided to step into your own light? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more stories about quiet strength, hard-earned justice, and the people who discover their worth long after the world overlooked them.